Hello there, Boris Sleepy History here. Look, when you hear the name Cleopatra, what do you picture? A woman in a gold-trimmed dress lounging in a palace, maybe some guy fawning over her. Romance, seduction, danger wrapped up in silk and perfume. That's what Hollywood has sold us for more than a century. The version of history that's been passed around is basically a love story with a tragic ending, right? A beautiful queen who seduced her way to power and then lost it all. She's the femme fatale, the woman who brings men to their knees through nothing but raw animal magnetism. But here's the problem with that story. It's almost entirely false. What we've actually forgotten is something far more dangerous than beauty, far more threatening than any simple affair. We've forgotten that Cleopatra was one of the most intelligent, strategically brilliant and ruthless political operatives of her age. She wasn't a victim of romance. She was a mastermind who understood power in ways most of her contemporaries didn't even know existed. The woman who ruled Egypt for 2 decades wasn't playing some delicate game of charm and flirtation. She was engaged in high-stakes political warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, economic strategy, and military planning. She was remarkably good at all of it. Before we dive into who she actually was, I need you to understand something crucial. Everything you think you know about Cleopatra was either deliberately distorted or accidentally oversimplified by people who had very good reasons to tear her legacy apart. So let's start by stripping away the myth and seeing what was actually there. A mind sharper than any sword, an economy she wielded like a weapon, a navy that terrified Rome itself, the ability to eliminate her enemies without leaving evidence. This is the story of why Cleopatra was far, far more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. Most of what we believe about Cleopatra comes from a single source. Not a fair historian, not a neutral observer, but Octavian, the man who defeated her, the man who had every reason to lie through his teeth. Think about that for a second. The victor writes history. The person who wins gets to tell everyone else what the fight was really about, what it meant, whether it was noble or shameful. And Octavian had a serious problem on his hands, a serious, embarrassing problem. He'd just beaten a woman in a military and political conflict. In his culture, that was awkward. Men were supposed to beat other men in political struggles. They were supposed to compete with other males over territory, power, resources. They weren't supposed to crush a woman in military competition, no matter how powerful she was. It made him look bad. It made Roman audiences uncomfortable. So what did Octavian do? He did what every propagandist does. He built a narrative, a story that would make his victory seem less like a triumph over a powerful political rival and more like a victory against some kind of dangerous seductress. He took everything Cleopatra was, everything she'd accomplished, and he reduced it to one thing: her sexuality. He convinced Roman writers, poets, and historians to describe her as a seductress, a manipulator, a woman who used her body as a tool because she had no other weapons available to her. Plutarch, the famous ancient historian, wrote that she had an irresistible charm. The word irresistible is crucial here. It absolves everyone around her of personal responsibility. If her charm was irresistible, then the men who followed her didn't really have a choice. She didn't defeat them through intelligence or military strategy or economic leverage. She seduced them. She made them unable to resist her. She was their temptress. They were her victims. But here's what modern scholarship has revealed through careful analysis of the actual historical record. It's looked at what Cleopatra actually did, separate from what Roman propaganda said she did. It's looked at the documentation, the coins, the inscriptions, the policies she implemented, and the evidence is absolutely stunning. The relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't romantic entanglements at all. They were calculated political maneuvers designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. Historians have documented that these encounters were meticulously planned, goal-oriented meetings where Cleopatra deployed her intellect, her wit, and her strategic vision as carefully as any general deploys troops. She didn't seduce Caesar out of emotional passion. She strategically aligned herself with the most powerful man in Rome to ensure Egypt's survival during a period of Roman civil war. She identified his needs, his vulnerabilities, his strategic interests, and she positioned Egypt and herself as the solution to his problems. She didn't seduce Antony because she fell in love with him. She demonstrated to him that she was indispensable, that her wealth, her military power, and her strategic vision made her the essential partner in his ambitions for Eastern expansion. That's something completely different from the seduction narrative that we've been taught. What makes this understanding dangerous? What makes Cleopatra's approach to power so different from what people expected? It's dangerous because it shows that Cleopatra understood something that most male rulers of her era never actually grasped, despite having centuries of examples. She understood that politics isn't just about armies and soldiers, and who has bigger weapons and more men under arms. It's not just about territory and borders, and which kingdom owns which cities and which regions. It's about resources, about controlling what people need. It's about information, about knowing what others don't know. It's about timing, about understanding what your opponent actually wants and needs, and then positioning yourself as the only person who can provide it to them. It's about making yourself so valuable, so necessary, so irreplaceable that removing you would cost more than keeping you. She was a strategist, wearing the costume of a woman in love. She was a chess player disguised as a romantic. But the costume was so convincing, the performance so flawless, and the strategy so deep and multifaceted that even now, thousands of years later, we're still fooled by the act. We still see her as a seductress rather than as what she actually was, a brilliant political operative. But then there's the languages. The languages are something that really can't be overlooked or understated in importance. Cleopatra spoke somewhere between 9 and a dozen languages fluently. Let that sink in for a moment. 9 to a dozen languages. In a world without translation apps, without simultaneous translation technology, without instant communication of any kind, without any technological assistance whatsoever, that was like holding the master keys to every kingdom in the Mediterranean. She could speak to Egyptian peasants in their language, building loyalty and connection through direct personal interaction that no other Greek ruler before her had bothered to create. She could speak to Nubian rulers in their own tongue, negotiating alliances as equals and partners rather than as a foreign occupier, imposing grey culture. She could address the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic elite in their language, demonstrating that she wasn't just a ruler by accident of birth, but a genuine scholar and an intellectual of the highest order. For her survival and her power. She could speak directly to Roman senators and generals in Latin, the language of power and empire. No intermediaries, no reliance on translators who might misrepresent her meaning or soften her words, no filters between her mind and theirs. Just her, using her own voice, using their own language to persuade them of her position, to make them understand why Egypt's interests aligned with Rome's interests, why supporting her was worth the investment. That's not just an accomplishment or a party trick. That's a genuine weapon, a tool of power, and it was a weapon that ancient Rome had never encountered in quite that form before. No other ruler had ever done this. The standard royal protocol of her era involved isolation and distance. A god-king or god-queen who held herself above the people, who spoke through priests and advisors and intermediaries, who maintained distance and mystique as tools of control and reverence. Cleopatra broke that entire system. She spoke directly to her people in their own language. She appeared in public. She engaged in dialogue. This wasn't incompetence or a failure to maintain royal dignity. It was strategic genius of the highest order. She understood something that other rulers missed. In order to maintain power in a complex, multi-ethnic, constantly unstable society like Egypt, where multiple populations with different religions and cultures had to coexist under one rule, she needed her people to feel like they actually knew her, like they had a personal connection to her leadership, like she represented them. She gave them exactly that. She made herself visible. She made herself human. And in doing so, she made herself impossible to ignore or remove. She also understood something else that most of her peers completely failed to grasp, something that wouldn't be understood in Western politics for nearly another 2,000 years. She understood that controlling food supply was equivalent to controlling empires themselves. Egypt, under her rule, was the primary source of wheat for the entire Roman population. Rome depended on Egyptian grain the way a human actually depends on oxygen. The Roman people would literally starve if the grain stopped flowing. Octavian knew this. That's why, at the end of their conflict, he couldn't just let her go. He couldn't let Egypt remain independent under her leadership. Because as long as Cleopatra controlled Egypt's grain supply, she had leverage over Rome itself. She could hold the entire Roman Republic hostage by simply restricting exports. She could use that leverage to negotiate independence, to demand recognition, to protect her dynasty. That's not seduction. That's economic warfare. And it's far more dangerous than any military force could ever be. To understand Cleopatra, you have to understand the world she was born into, because that world shaped everything she would become. The Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt wasn't stable. It wasn't peaceful. It was a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion. 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, the Ptolemaic dynasty had seized control of Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. It was a Greek dynasty, Greek military leadership, Greek cultural values, Greek language in the royal court, and they were ruling an Egyptian nation with thousands of years of Egyptian history, Egyptian religion, Egyptian culture, Egyptian traditions. That fundamental mismatch created immediate and ongoing tension that never really went away. The Greek-speaking elite who controlled the government wanted to maintain their Greek identity and their cultural dominance. The Egyptian population, especially the incredibly powerful priesthood of the temples, wanted their culture respected, their religion honored, their voice heard in governance. These two groups were always in conflict, always jockeying for position and power, always suspicious of each other's intentions. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, the kingdom had been splitting apart for decades. Successive Ptolemaic rulers had been weak, had been ineffectual, or had been actively harmful to Egypt's stability and prosperity. Some had lost territory to regional powers. Some had made catastrophically bad deals with Rome. Some had spent their entire reigns murdering siblings and consolidating power rather than actually governing the kingdom effectively. The result was a kingdom that was economically weakened despite being theoretically wealthy, militarily vulnerable despite having resources, and politically fractured despite being theoretically unified under royal rule. The Ptolemaic throne was coveted by everyone with ambition, but it was also incredibly dangerous to hold. Holding it meant constant threats from within and without. It meant navigating the increasingly aggressive interest of Rome in Egyptian affairs. The Romans wanted Egypt either as a client state or as a direct possession. They didn't particularly care which. It meant managing the resentment of the Egyptian priesthood, who felt their religion and culture were being systematically suppressed by Greek rulers who didn't respect Egyptian traditions. It meant dealing with ambitious siblings who saw the throne as a prize they could snatch if you showed any weakness. Into this chaos, Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. She wasn't the obvious heir to the throne. She was the third child, a daughter in a society where sons were typically favored for rulership. But she was also born into a family where simply being of royal blood meant you were both incredibly privileged and incredibly vulnerable. One moment you could be a respected royal child with access to education and resources. The next moment, a political shift could leave you exiled, impoverished, or dead. Her father was Ptolemy XII, known as Ptolemy the flute player, actually known as this because he was more interested in music and personal pleasure than in governance. He was a weak ruler, and Egypt's rivals and internal factions knew it immediately. He'd made humiliating deals with Rome just to stay in power. He'd alienated the incredibly powerful priesthood of the temples. He'd made himself financially and militarily dependent on foreign money and foreign military support, just to maintain his throne. Cleopatra watched all of this as a young girl. She was educated at the royal court with access to the greatest scholars of the age. She studied under the personal tutelage of Alexandria's most renowned intellectuals. While her father fumbled through his reign, making one bad decision after another, she was absorbing knowledge of philosophy, mathematics, science, rhetoric, and languages. She was learning how to think critically, how to analyze problems, how to understand strategy and power dynamics. But more than that, she was learning what not to do. She was watching her father's failures in real time. She was seeing exactly how weakness invited predation from all sides. She was understanding that emotion and indulgence were luxury goods that rulers simply couldn't afford. This education was brutal in its own way. It was traumatic. She watched her father lose the respect of his own people. She watched Egypt become increasingly dependent on Rome for military support and financial assistance. She watched her father make deals that weakened Egypt's position and strengthened Rome's leverage over the kingdom. And somewhere in that watching, absorbing, learning, she came to understand that ruling Egypt wasn't about music or comfort or any form of personal indulgence. It was about survival. It was about understanding that every single decision could be the one that cost you your throne, your life, or your nation's independence. The kingdom she was born into had at least 5 major competing power centers, all struggling for dominance. The royal family itself, which was split into rival factions and competing interests. The Greek-speaking elite in Alexandria and the other major cities who wanted to maintain Greek control. The Egyptian priesthood, incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful because they controlled the temples and the spiritual life of the people. The Roman Republic, increasingly interested in taking direct control of Egyptian affairs, rather than just influencing them from a distance. Regional powers like the Kingdom of Nubia, the Arabian kingdoms, and the remnants of the Seleucid Empire, all watching for any signs of weakness they could exploit. Navigating all of this successfully would have been challenging, even for a strong, experienced male ruler with powerful allies backing him up. But Cleopatra was a woman in an aggressively patriarchal society, educated but untested in real power, with powerful enemies and very few natural allies she could truly count on. This was the powder keg she would eventually have to defuse. Cleopatra's life was shaped by crisis from the very beginning, from the moment she was conscious enough to understand that crisis was happening around her. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was genuinely despised by the Egyptian priesthood because they saw him as a weak ruler who didn't respect Egyptian traditions, and he was resented by the Greek elite because they thought he was incompetent. When Cleopatra was around 8 years old, her father made a disastrous political decision that would change everything. He aligned himself too closely with Rome in ways the Egyptian priesthood found unacceptable. They decided they'd had enough of him. Using their power and their influence over the Egyptian population, they forced him from the throne. The king of Egypt was literally exiled driven out of power by the priests and the people who no longer wanted him. Cleopatra's childhood was massively disrupted by her father's exile. Everything about her family's situation became unstable overnight. The throne was contested. The future was uncertain. Her older sister Berenice took control of the throne and tried to rule, but Berenice was unpopular with significant portions of the population, and she was unstable as a ruler. For several years, the Ptolemaic royal family was fragmented, scattered across different cities, fighting amongst themselves, with no clear authority figure. It was chaotic and dangerous. And then, her father made a move that would fundamentally shape her entire future life. He went to Rome. He traveled to Rome and he petitioned the Roman Republic for military aid, asking them to send legions to help him reclaim his throne from his own daughter. And Rome, always looking for an opportunity to increase its influence and control in Egypt, agreed to help him. Roman legions marched into Egypt. Her father was restored to power. The priests who had exiled him were purged, and Egypt became, for all practical purposes, a client state of Rome, rather than an independent kingdom. Cleopatra watched all of this happening. She was old enough to understand what was happening. She understood that her father's move had made Egypt subordinate to Rome in a way it had never been before. She understood that while he regained his throne, he'd lost something far more important: Egypt's independence. Egypt was now dependent on Rome for security, and Rome expected to be paid for that security. From that point forward, Cleopatra grew up knowing one crucial fact that most of her contemporaries didn't fully understand. If Egypt was going to survive and maintain any independence at all, it would have to play Rome very carefully. It would have to maintain just enough independence and just enough pride to satisfy its own people, the priests and the population who wanted Egypt to be Egypt. But it also had to be submissive enough to satisfy Rome's ambitions and Rome's demand for control and resources. It was a tightrope, a balancing act that no ruler could maintain forever. But Cleopatra understood the stakes from her childhood. Everyone in the royal family knew what the stakes were. When her father died in 51 BC, Cleopatra was 18 years old. She was old enough to rule, old enough to make decisions, too old to be overlooked or dismissed. But the traditional succession was genuinely unclear. Her father's will designated her as co-ruler with her eldest brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10 years old at that time. In Egyptian law and tradition, sometimes a wife could be co-ruler with her husband, and sometimes a sister could be co-ruler with her brother. The situation was legitimately ambiguous. No one could point to a clear legal precedent. Cleopatra had the education, the intellect, and arguably the demonstrated ability to rule effectively. But she was a woman, and her brother was a male, even if he was only a child. And in that time and place, male succession was still preferred despite her evident capabilities. What followed over the next few years would teach Cleopatra everything she needed to know about power, betrayal, and survival in the cutthroat world of royal polity. She was about to learn a lesson that would define her entire reign. Having a crown and keeping a crown were two completely different things. Having legal claim to power and actually maintaining power were not the same thing at all. As soon as her father died and Cleopatra took her position as co-ruler with her much younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, the real trouble began immediately. Her brother was still a child, barely 10 years old, too young to understand politics, too young to understand power, too young to really do anything except be a figurehead. According to Ptolemaic tradition and law, Cleopatra was supposed to act as regent, guiding his education and helping him gradually assume power as he matured and grew older. But Egypt was too important to too many people for anyone to actually let a woman and a child run the kingdom unchallenged. Almost immediately, a group of powerful courtiers, ambitious generals, and wealthy aristocrats, began a coordinated campaign to manipulate young Ptolemy against his sister. They convinced him that his sister was a threat. They convinced him that his sister was a threat to his eventual rule, that she would never actually relinquish power to him, that he needed to act now to protect his interests. They played on the natural sibling competition that exists between brothers and sisters, especially in a context where power and wealth are at stake. And it worked. By around 48 BC, just 3 years into her father's reign, Ptolemy's advisors had successfully accomplished their goal of turning him against Cleopatra. They'd poisoned the relationship. They'd made him believe that his sister was his enemy. The boy king, now in his early teens but still under the control of his advisors, moved against his sister with their encouragement. He had her removed from the official seals and documents that bore the royal names. He eliminated her from the coinage that was issued in the kingdom, removing her image and her name from the money. Officially, by decree, she was stripped of her co-regency. Practically, she was being pushed out of power, exiled, isolated, made irrelevant. But Cleopatra didn't accept this quietly or gracefully. She didn't go into exile with grace and dignity. She didn't accept a graceful retirement or a life of obscurity. Instead, she did something that would have seemed absolutely suicidal to most people in her position, something that would have been unthinkable for most women of her era. She gathered her supporters. She raised an army. She left Egypt and traveled to Syria, where she gathered military forces from allied kingdoms and mercenary forces willing to fight for pay. She was preparing for civil war against her own brother, against the boy king who had been manipulated into casting her out. This is the moment where the seduction story completely and totally falls apart. A woman who seduces her way to power wouldn't start a civil war. That doesn't make sense. A woman who relies on charm and beauty as her primary tools wouldn't march armies across the desert in difficult conditions to reclaim a throne. That's not seduction. That's conquest. Cleopatra was preparing to conquer Egypt by force if necessary. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in several generations who was actually willing to fight for power instead of just inheriting it passively and hoping for the best. The civil war that followed lasted for years. It wasn't a simple military conflict between two armies. It was a complex political struggle fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. Ptolemy's advisors had the clear advantage of controlling Egypt's capital city, Alexandria, and therefore its resources, its treasury, its government apparatus. But Cleopatra had something equally important, something that sometimes matters more than physical territory. She had supporters who genuinely believed in her, who thought she was the better choice for ruler. She had shown strategic brilliance in raising military forces, in making alliances with neighboring kingdoms, in refusing to be pushed aside simply because she was a woman in a patriarchal society. She had demonstrated that she understood military logistics, that she could command loyalty from soldiers and officers, that she could make hard decisions when necessary. The conflict dragged on over years, with neither side able to completely defeat the other militarily. Armies fought battles. Diplomacy failed repeatedly. Negotiations broke down without reaching agreements. Egypt was literally tearing itself apart from the inside, with civil war draining resources and destabilizing the entire kingdom. Neither Cleopatra nor her brother could defeat the other with local Egyptian forces alone. Neither had the military power to achieve a total victory. Both were dependent on external powers for support. Both were trying desperately to get Rome to support their side of the conflict, because Rome's support would mean Roman legions, and Roman legions could decide the outcome. This is the moment when Caesar entered the picture. And this is the moment when everything changed forever. Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, not deliberately to settle an Egyptian dynasty dispute, but because he was chasing his political enemy Pompey across the Mediterranean. The Roman civil war had spilled into Egypt. Caesar was pursuing Pompey, who had fled eastward toward Egypt, seeking shelter and allies. When Caesar arrived at Alexandria, He found a kingdom that was in the middle of its own civil war, with Cleopatra's forces and her brother's forces locked in a military stalemate, neither side able to achieve total victory. Cleopatra's personal position at this moment was absolutely desperate. She was camped outside Alexandria, essentially living in a military camp in the desert. She didn't control the capital city. She didn't control the royal treasury. She didn't control the royal palace or any of the government buildings. Her brother's advisors had the clear advantage of holding the city and therefore controlling Egypt's governmental apparatus. And then a Roman general arrived in Alexandria, a general more powerful than anyone in Egypt, a general with legions, with resources, with the ability to decide who would be the next ruler of Egypt. For most rulers in Cleopatra's position, this moment would have been an absolute catastrophe, the complete end of her hopes. For Cleopatra, it was an opportunity. She was smart enough to see it. She understood that Caesar was going to make a decision one way or another, and that decision would be consequential. He would either support her brother, or he would support her. That choice would essentially determine the outcome of the civil war. She had to make herself indispensable to him. She had to figure out how to make Caesar understand that supporting her was the better strategic choice, that her interests aligned with his interests. Now, the traditional story that has been passed down through the centuries goes like this. Cleopatra seduced Caesar. She rolled herself up in a carpet like some kind of living present and had herself carried to his chambers. She used her beauty and her charm to win him over. She's a seductress and he's her victim. And yes, ancient sources do mention seduction. But what they actually reveal, if you read them carefully with a critical mind and understanding of political context, is something much more calculated and strategic. Cleopatra didn't roll herself in a carpet and show up naked in Caesar's chambers. That's theatrical nonsense. She showed up with an introduction from a trusted intermediary, perfectly dressed, appropriately adorned, at a time when Caesar would be expecting a political meeting with a serious person. She arrived as a serious political figure, not as a seductress playing games. She came prepared to discuss terms, to negotiate alliances, to demonstrate why Caesar's political and strategic interests were best served by supporting her claim to the throne instead of supporting her brother. Yes, they became lovers. That part is true. But that relationship was political theatre, a performance. It was a way to seal an alliance that they had both already agreed to on strategic and rational grounds. Caesar needed to control Egypt to secure his position in the east. Cleopatra needed military support to defeat her brother and take sole control of the throne. They both needed a reason for Caesar's presence in Egypt and his military intervention to seem justified to both Roman audiences and Egyptian audiences. Romance and seduction gave them that cover story. It made the arrangement seem more natural, more emotionally motivated. But underneath the romance, the seduction, the theatre, this was pure strategic calculation. Cleopatra had carefully analysed Caesar's needs and his vulnerabilities. She understood that he needed Egypt to supply grain to Rome, to provide wealth and resources, and to be stable enough not to create additional problems for Rome. She understood that her brother's advisors were not trusted by Rome, that they were widely seen as incompetent and unable to manage the kingdom effectively. She understood rationally that Caesar would logically prefer to deal with someone intelligent and capable. She presented herself to Caesar not as a beautiful seductress, but as the ruler Egypt actually needed, the best choice for Roman interests, as the intelligent, multilingual, educated alternative to a weak boy king being manipulated by incompetent courtiers and generals. Caesar agreed with her analysis, not because he was seduced and lost his judgment, but because she was right. Her arguments made sense. And then they formalized their alliance with romance, with personal relationship, with the appearance of an emotional connexio. With Caesar's military backing and Roman legions at her side, Cleopatra won the civil war decisively. Her forces defeated her brother's armies. She took complete control of all of Egypt. And for the first time in her entire life, after years of struggle and crisis, she had actual, undisputed power. She was the queen, not a co-regent sharing power, not someone answerable to advisors or generals, but the Queen of Egypt, answerable to no one except Rome itself, and even then only in the most general sense. And even with Rome, she was beginning to understand that there was room for negotiation, for strategy, for a woman smart enough to make herself indispensable to Rome's interests. The conflict that followed is known to historians as the Alexandrian War, a civil conflict that started with Cleopatra's attempt to reclaim power from her brother and ended with her as the undisputed ruler of Egypt. But calling it the Alexandrian War makes it sound like a simple military conflict, a straightforward battle between two armies where the stronger force won and went home victorious. The reality was far more complicated and far messier. The war wasn't just fought in Alexandria. It was a conflict that drew in Rome. Drew in regional powers, drew in mercenaries and adventurers and opportunists from every corner of the known world. And it was a conflict that required Cleopatra to demonstrate not just military acumen, but also the ability to manage alliances, handle diplomacy, coordinate complex logistics, and maintain the loyalty of her supporters even when the situation looked hopeless. The Alexandrian War lasted for years. It was brutal and devastating. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides suffered incredible losses. The city of Alexandria itself was damaged and destabilized by the conflict. Cleopatra understood something crucial that her opponents didn't. She understood that you don't have to win a military conflict decisively. You just have to make the cost of continuing the conflict so high that your opponent decides it's not worth it anymore. She made the cost of opposing her so high that eventually her brother's advisors, his generals, his supporters, realized that supporting Ptolemy XIII was a losing proposition. And when Caesar's legions arrived and made it clear which side Rome was supporting, the decision became inevitable. Ptolemy XIII died. Many historians suspect he was killed in battle during the final stages of the conflict. Some sources suggest he drowned trying to escape across the Nile River. But either way, he was gone. His faction was defeated, and Cleopatra was left standing as the undisputed ruler of Egypt, with Caesar's military might backing her authority and with the legitimacy that came from defeating her enemies and proving she could actually govern effectively. The Alexandrian War was Cleopatra's first major test as a political and military leader, and she passed. She didn't just win, she won in a way that demonstrated her ability to handle complexity, to manage competing interests, to keep her coalition together, even when things looked bleak. She demonstrated that she wasn't going to be a puppet ruler. She wasn't going to be a figurehead who would do what her advisors told her to do. She was going to be an actual ruler who made decisions, who took responsibility for outcomes, who was willing to bear the political costs of her choices. The people of Egypt could see this. The priesthood could see this. The Greek-speaking elite in Alexandria could see this. Everyone who mattered understood that Cleopatra had proven herself capable. She had proven that she could hold power, and she was not going to be pushed aside easily. Caesar, for his part, was extremely pleased with the outcome. He now had a stable, friendly ruler in Egypt who was intelligent, who understood his interests, and who had shown she could actually manage a kingdom effectively. Egypt was secure. Egypt was loyal to Rome. Egypt was going to continue to provide grain and resources to Rome. Everything was working exactly as it should have been, except for one problem. There was a child, Caesar's child, born to Cleopatra. while Caesar was in Egypt, during or immediately after the Alexandrian War. The child was named Ptolemy Caesar. History would know him as Caesarion, and his existence was about to create a danger so profound that it would reshape the entire political landscape of the ancient world. Caesarion was Caesar's son. By all accounts, he was a healthy, intelligent child who bore a strong physical resemblance to his father, and his existence was politically catastrophic for Rome. Think about what Caesarion represented. He was the biological son of Julius Caesar. He was also, through his mother, the heir to the throne of Egypt. He was the living embodiment of a union between Rome's most powerful man and Egypt's most important kingdom. He was a child who could grow up and claim not just Egypt, but also Rome itself. He was a potential claimant to Roman power as the direct biological descendant of Caesar. Now, Caesar was married. He had a Roman wife named Calpurnia. And in Roman culture, a child born outside of a legitimate Roman marriage was technically illegitimate, was not a direct heir to Roman power, did not have the legal right to claim anything in Rome. But Caesarion was in Egypt. Caesarion was educated by Cleopatra. Caesarion was known to be Caesar's son. And Caesarion had a powerful mother who was deeply invested in his well-being and in his future. Cleopatra was not naive. She understood immediately that her son represented a potential power base, a potential rallying point for people who wanted to oppose whatever government emerged in Rome after Caesar. She was thinking ahead, thinking about the long term, thinking about what kind of legacy she could leave, what kind of dynasty she could establish. She was thinking about the possibility that her son could unite Egypt and Rome under a single rule, under a rule that was fundamentally different from the autocratic system that was emerging in Rome. That was dangerous. That was so dangerous that, after Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, multiple Roman factions immediately became interested in Caesarion's status. Some factions thought they could use Caesarion as a pawn, as a way to legitimize their own power claims. Other factions thought that Caesarion was a threat, that the boy needed to be eliminated before he could become a rallying point for opposition. Cleopatra, understanding the danger, took immediate action. She wanted to secure her son's status, to make him legitimate in Egyptian law, to give him a position of power that would be recognized and respected throughout the Mediterranean. She named him Ptolemy, the 15th, Philopator, Philadelphus, Neos, Dionysos. She made him her co-ruler, her official heir. She gave him the title that had been used for previous rulers. She was essentially declaring to the world that Caesarion was the legitimate heir to Egypt, that he was not some bastard child, but an official, recognized, powerful figure in his own right. But she went further. She also declared him and herself as Queen of Kings and King of Kings. These were titles of tremendous symbolic importance. They implied that Cleopatra and Caesarion were not just rulers of Egypt, but rulers of rulers, superior to all the other kingdoms and principalities that surrounded them. When news of these declarations reached Rome, the reaction was one of absolute horror. Conservative Romans, military men, senators, all of them understood immediately what Cleopatra was doing. She was positioning her son to become a rival power center. She was declaring that Egypt and Rome were separate entities, that Egypt was not subordinate to Rome, that Cleopatra and Caesarion were independent rulers who had no intention of accepting Roman dominance. For men like Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, Caesarion represented an existential threat. Octavian was trying to consolidate power in Rome. Octavian was trying to eliminate his rivals and establish his own authority. Octavian could not tolerate the existence of a child who had a better biological claim to be Caesar's heir than Octavian himself did. and Octavian could not tolerate the existence of a potential alliance between Egypt and Rome that would undermine his authority. Caesarion had to be eliminated. It was not a question of if, but of when. Cleopatra knew this. She understood that her son was in danger. She understood that Rome would not tolerate the existence of a child who could potentially challenge its authority. And she understood that she would have to be extremely careful to protect him, to keep him safe, to prepare him for a future that might never come. But she never stopped believing in his potential. She never stopped working to secure his position. She never stopped thinking strategy, cally, about how to make him powerful enough that Rome would have to respect him or fear him. That was the danger that Caesarion represented. That was why Octavian eventually had him killed, why Rome eventually decided that the child had to be eliminated. Caesarion was not just Cleopatra's son. He was a potential unifier of East and West. He was a potential threat to everything that Octavian was trying to build. And in the world of Roman politics, potential threats had to be dealt with, had to be eliminated before they could become actual threats. There's a moment in history where everything changes, where one decision, one moment, one event shifts the trajectory of the entire world. For Cleopatra, that moment came when Caesar summoned her to Rome, not to visit, not for diplomacy, but to be displayed, to be shown off, to be paraded in front of the Roman people as Caesar's prize. And she went. She took her son with her. She took her entourage. She brought Egyptian luxury and Egyptian pageantry to Rome itself. And Rome was shocked. Rome had never seen anything like it. Cleopatra was not like Roman women. She didn't dress like them. She didn't speak like them. She didn't behave like them. She was foreign. She was exotic. She was powerful in ways that Roman women were not allowed to be powerful. She was a ruler in her own right. She had armies. She had fleets. She had wealth. She had authority. And she walked through Rome with her head held high, utterly unimpressed and unintimidated by the power and grandeur of the Roman Republic. The Roman elite were scandalized. Some of them loved it. Some of them were absolutely horrified by it. But everyone was talking about her. Everyone was fascinated by her. Everyone wanted to know who this woman was, where she came from, what her connection to Caesar actually meant. It was a masterclass in public relations. It was a masterclass in using spectacle and display to influence public opinion. Cleopatra understood that she needed the Roman people to see her as legitimate, as powerful, as someone worth respecting. So she gave them a show. She gave them something they'd never seen before. She gave them Cleopatra. And the Roman people, despite themselves, despite their own cultural assumptions about women and power, couldn't help but be impressed. There were rumors about her and Caesar. There were whispers about the nature of their relationship. There were suggestions that she was trying to seduce Caesar into making her some kind of queen of Rome, that she was trying to turn Caesar into a king and make herself the queen beside him. These rumors were politically catastrophic. Rome was a republic. Rome didn't have kings. Rome had explicitly rejected kings centuries before. The idea that Caesar might become a king, that he might accept a crown, that he might try to establish a dynasty with Cleopatra as his queen, that was the kind of thing that would make Romans reach for their knives. But that's exactly what the rumors suggested. That's exactly what the most conservative elements of Rome became increasingly convinced was happening. And those rumors would contribute, eventually, to Caesar's assassination. But before that could happen, Cleopatra had to navigate Rome's political landscape as carefully as she'd ever navigated anything. She had to appear powerful, but not threatening, confident, but not arrogant, foreign, but not alien. She had to give Caesar what he wanted while simultaneously maintaining her own autonomy and her own agenda. And she did it. She managed it. She walked the line perfectly. She stayed in Rome long enough to make a statement. long enough to demonstrate Egypt's importance, long enough to secure her position as Caesar's favored ally. And then, when she sensed the danger, when she understood that the political winds in Rome were shifting, when she felt the resentment and the fear building among Rome, as elite, she left. She took her son. She returned to Egypt, and she waited to see what would happen next. On the Ides of March, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated. He was stabbed to death by a group of senators, including people who had been his closest allies. The conspiracy against him had been building for months. The rumors about Cleopatra, about a potential monarchy, about Caesar being distracted by Egypt and by a foreign queen, all of that had contributed to the sense that Caesar had lost touch with Roman values, that he had become a threat to the Republic itself. Whether Cleopatra actually tried to turn Caesar into a king, or whether she was simply the convenient scapegoat that Caesar's enemies used to justify his assassination is something historians still debate. But it doesn't matter. She was in Rome when she heard the news. She was in Rome when she heard the news. She was in a foreign city, surrounded by men who had just killed her lover, her ally, her child's father. She was a visible foreigner, a symbol of the foreign influence that had supposedly corrupted Caesar. She was in danger, and she knew it immediately. The people who had killed Caesar were now in power. The people who resented Egypt's influence were now calling the shots. The people who saw Caesarion as a threat were now in position to act on that belief. Cleopatra made a decision. She took her son. She gathered her people. She left Rome as quickly and as quietly as she could. She went back to Egypt. She went back to the one place where she had absolute control, where she had loyal forces, where she could defend herself and her son. And she started planning. She started thinking about what came next. She started understanding that the world had fundamentally changed. Caesar was gone. Rome was about to descend into civil war. Multiple factions were fighting for control. Multiple generals were raising armies. Multiple alliances were being formed and dissolved. And Egypt, under Cleopatra's rule, was going to have to navigate this chaos carefully. She couldn't just support whoever seemed strongest, because whoever seemed strongest today might be destroyed tomorrow. She had to play the different factions against each other. It created a moment where a smart ruler could position herself to benefit from the conflict without being destroyed by it. And Cleopatra understood immediately that the key to surviving Roman civil war was making herself indispensable to one of the major factions. Not essential in a way that could be easily replaced, but essential in a way that made her irreplaceable. Essential because of the resources she controlled. Essential because of the military forces she could deploy. Essential because of her intelligence and her strategic vision. This was going to require all of her intelligence, all of her strategic skill, all of her willingness to make difficult choices. And she was ready. She had trained for this moment her entire life. Everything that had happened to her, everything she had learned, everything she had experienced, it had all been preparation for this moment. And she was going to prove that she was more dangerous, more intelligent, and more capable than anyone in Rome had given her credit for. Mark Antony was not Caesar. He was similar in some ways, but fundamentally different in others. He was a military man, a general, someone who understood strategy and tactics and the movement of armies. He was not a political theorist or a philosopher, building an empire in the East, of becoming rich and powerful and legendary. And when Rome began to descend into civil war, when different factions began raising armies and fighting for control, Mark Antony saw an opportunity. He moved to the east. He took control of the eastern provinces. He began consolidating power, building military forces, establishing himself as the most powerful man in the eastern Mediterranean. And he began to understand that if he was going to succeed, he was going to need allies. He was going to need money. He was going to need military support. And the richest, most powerful potential ally in the East was Egypt. So in 41 BC, he summoned Cleopatra to meet him, not as a request, as a command. He wanted her to come to Tarsus, a city in Asia Minor. He wanted to meet her in person. He wanted to assess her, understand her, figure out whether she was worth dealing with, or whether she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Cleopatra understood the stakes. She understood that Antony was incredibly powerful. She understood that he could destroy Egypt if he decided to. She understood that her response to this summons was going to determine whether Antony would become an ally or an enemy. So she decided to stage a performance. She decided to arrive in a way that Antony would never forget. She arrived on a royal barge. She sailed up the river toward Tarsus, and her entire entourage with her. She sailed up the river toward Tarsus, and the rumors of her arrival spread throughout the city. People came out to see her. People lined the riverbanks to watch her pass. Soldiers left their posts. Merchants abandoned their shops. Everyone wanted to see the Queen of Egypt, dressed as a goddess, sailing through their city like she was a divine being descending from the heavens. The orchestration of the moment was perfect. She arrived at dusk, when the light was golden and warm, when the sun was casting long shadows across the water. The timing was not accidental. The lighting was perfect for making everything look as impressive and as beautiful as possible. Her attendants wore costumes designed to look like attendants of Isis. The musicians played instruments that created an otherworldly sacred sound. The very air around the barge seemed to shimmer with divinity, with power, with a kind of mystical authority that Antony had never encountered before. This was not just a diplomatic visit. This was a religious experience. This was a performance designed to make Antony feel like he was in the presence of something sacred, something that transcended ordinary political negotiation. Antony was supposed to come to her. That was the protocol. That was what was expected. The more powerful person goes to meet the less powerful person. That was how diplomacy worked in the ancient world. But Antony was so surprised, so impressed, so completely overwhelmed by the spectacle of Cleopatra's arrival that he went to her instead. He abandoned his position of power. He broke protocol. He went to her barge. He went to meet her on her terms. And in that moment, Cleopatra had already won. She had already established the dynamic of their relationship. She was not going to come to him as a subordinate. She was not going to appear desperate or needy. She was going to come to him as an equal, as a powerful ruler, as someone who deserved respect and admiration. And the fact that he came to her, the fact that he abandoned the convention that put him in the superior position, that was everything. It meant that she had already convinced him before they even had a real conversation. It meant he sat down to talk. The basic negotiating sat down to talk. The basic negotiating position had already shifted in her favor. Cleopatra understood that this first meeting was crucial. Antony was going to make judgments about her based on this encounter. He was going to decide whether to trust her. He was going to decide whether she was worth having as an ally. So she gave him exactly what he needed to see. She showed him wealth. She showed him power. She showed him that she was different from other women, that she was in a completely different category. She showed him that she was a ruler, not a concubine, not a prize, not something to be queered and discarded. And then she showed him something even more valuable than any of that. She showed him her mind. She discussed Egyptian military capabilities. She explained how many soldiers Egypt could deploy. She talked about the logistics of feeding and supplying armies. She described Egypt's naval capacity. She laid out the economic basis for funding prolonged military campaigns. She demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the Mediterranean geography, the political landscape, the strengths and weaknesses of various states and kingdoms. Antony, for all his military genius, was impressed. He had never met a woman who understood military and political strategy at this level. He had certainly never met a potential ally who could offer him the combination of resources, intelligence, and strategic vision that Cleopatra represented. By the end of that first meeting, Antony was convinced. He was committed to working with Cleopatra. He was ready to form an alliance. In fact, he was ready to make her a central part of his ambitions. And when Cleopatra recommended military strategies, when she suggested how he should deploy his forces, when she advised him about the future direction of his campaigns, Antony listened. He didn't dismiss her. He didn't treat her like a woman who didn't understand military matters. He listened because she was right. She had good advice. She understood strategy. She understood power. And her suggestions made sense. More than that, Antony began to understand that having Cleopatra as an advisor, as a strategic partner, as someone he could consult with before making major decisions, actually made him a better general. She saw things he missed. She understood implications that he hadn't considered. She had a long-term perspective that complemented his more immediate, tactical focus. Having her in his counsels made him more thoughtful, more careful, more strategic in his thinking. And in the ancient world, that kind of strategic advantage was worth more than almost anything else. But was it romance? Was Antony actually in love with Cleopatra? Or was it all just strategy and calculation on both sides? This is the question that has confused historians for centuries, and the answer is that it was probably both, but not in the way that most people think. Antony and Cleopatra did become lovers. That part is true. But their romantic relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect, mutual interest, and mutual advantage. They needed each other. Cleopatra needed Antony's military power to keep Egypt safe, to protect her from Rome's other factions, to keep her sons safe. She needed his legions, his military reputation, his ability to command loyalty from soldiers who had followed him through years of warfare. Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth, her military forces, her economic resources, to keep his ambitions alive, to keep his armies fed, to keep his Eastern Empire stable. He needed the grain from Egypt to feed his armies. He needed the harbour of Alexandria to secure his position in the Mediterranean. He needed the wealth and resources of Egypt to fund his military campaigns. He needed Cleopatra's intelligence and her understanding of Eastern politics to navigate the complex world of Asiatic kingdoms and states. They fell in love, or at least they became deeply attached to each other in a way that transcended simple political calculation. But that attachment was rooted in the fact that they were both extraordinarily useful to each other, that they genuinely made each other's lives better and more powerful. They made each other powerful. Cleopatra's wealth and resources made Antony's military ambitions possible. Antony's military power made Cleopatra's rule secure. It was a perfect match. It was a partnership based on genuine mutual need and genuine mutual benefit. And yes, there was also attraction. Yes, there was also passion. But the passion was secondary. The primary relationship was strategic. The primary relationship was based on power. Cleopatra didn't fall in love with Antony and then decide to support him militarily. She decided to support him militarily because it made strategic sense. And then she fell in love with him, or at least she developed an attachment to him that made the alliance stronger and more stable. She understood something that most people miss. Romance and strategy are not opposites. They can work together. They can reinforce each other. A genuine emotional attachment between two rulers can actually be more stable, more durable than a purely strategic alliance based on nothing but calculation. And Cleopatra and Antony did develop a genuine emotional attachment to each other. They genuinely cared about each other. They genuinely wanted to see each other succeed. But underneath that emotional attachment was a foundation of calculation, of strategy, of mutual advantage. And that foundation is what made their relationship so durable, so stable, and so dangerous to Rome. Because unlike a purely romantic relationship, which might fall apart if the passion faded, their relationship was rooted in something deeper. It was rooted in the fact that they genuinely needed each other. And as long as they needed each other, as long as their interests aligned, they were going to stay together. Their partnership meant that Antony had access to the resources he needed to build an empire in the East. It meant that Egypt was no longer vulnerable to being conquered by Rome or crushed by Rome's rivals. It meant that Cleopatra had a powerful military protector. It meant that they could work together to create something larger than either of them could create alone. They had children together. They had a vision of a future together. They had plans to build something that would outlast both of them. And they were going to represent an extraordinarily powerful force that Rome was going to have to deal with. What made their alliance truly dangerous was not the romance, not the spectacle, not the dramatic gestures and the public displays of affection. What made their alliance truly dangerous was the fact that they were united in their conviction that the ancient world could be organized differently than Rome wanted to organize it. Antony wanted to build an Eastern empire that was independent from Rome's Western hegemony. Cleopatra wanted Egypt to maintain its independence and its power. Together, they represented a vision of the world where Rome was not hegemonic, where power was distributed among multiple centers, where the East could resist the West, where a queen could rule as an equal partner with a military leader. They weren't just lovers, they were partners in a political project. They were collaborators in reimagining what the Mediterranean world could become. And that project was absolutely existential to Rome's leadership. For men like Octavian, who was consolidating power in Rome and who believed that Rome's destiny was to dominate the entire Mediterranean, the existence of Antony and Cleopatra as a united force was intolerable. It was not just a political threat. It was a threat to Rome's entire worldview. It was a threat to the idea that Rome was destined to rule. It was a threat to the vision of a unified, Roman-dominated world. And so Octavian came to understand, slowly but inevitably, that Antony and Cleopatra would have to be destroyed. Not because they were militarily superior, though at certain moments they were. Not because they were more powerful, though at certain moments they were more powerful than Octavian himself. But because they represented an alternative vision of the world, and that alternative vision had to be eliminated if Rome was going to become what Octavian dreamed it could become. This is what made Cleopatra and Antony's relationship so dangerous. This is what made their alliance so profound. This is why historians still talk about them, still debate them, still wonder what would have happened if they had won. Because if they had won, if they had managed to defeat Octavian, if they had managed to create an Eastern empire independent from Rome, the entire course of Western history would have been different. There would have been no Roman Empire as we know it. There would have been no spread of Roman culture and Roman law across the Mediterranean. The world would have developed according to a completely different pattern. And that future was not impossible. It was not pure fantasy. It was a genuine possibility, one that nearly came to pass, one that was only prevented through Octavian's military genius, his political ruthlessness, and his absolute determination to prevent it from happening. The fact that we ended up with the Roman Empire instead of with Antony and Cleopatra's Eastern Empire is not inevitable. It's not the result of some law of history. It's the result of specific choices, specific battles, specific moments of chance and fortune. And understanding the danger that Cleopatra and Antony represented helps us understand how close we came to a completely different world. But Octavian couldn't just attack Cleopatra on a whim, and he couldn't pretend that Egypt was just another client state that could be absorbed into Rome without consequence. Egypt was rich. Egypt was organized. Egypt was powerful. And Egypt was in the hands of a woman who understood exactly how dangerous that made her. Understanding Egypt's economic power is essential to understanding why Octavian felt compelled to move against Cleopatra and why he did it with such absolute determination. Egypt wasn't just wealthy. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. In an ancient world without global trade networks, without refrigeration, without the ability to transport food across vast distances quickly, regional food production was everything. And Egypt was the region that produced the most food. The Nile River's annual floods created some of the most fertile farmland in the known world. The floods were predictable, the harvests were massive, and whoever controlled Egypt controlled the grain supply that fed Rome's masses. This was not a minor strategic advantage. This was the difference between a stable empire and a starving empire. A hungry Rome was a Rome ready for revolution. The breadlines would form, the mobs would gather, and within days the government could fall. So food security wasn't just an economic issue for Rome. It was a political survival issue. And Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She understood that if Rome ever truly depended on her goodwill for its grain supply, Rome would have to negotiate with her, would have to respect her, would have to treat her as an equal rather than as a subordinate. She understood the physics of power in the ancient world, and grain was the thing that Rome needed. And grain was the thing that Rome needed more than almost anything else. Without grain, Rome couldn't feed its population. Without grain, Rome's government would collapse within weeks. Without grain, the entire Roman system would break down. She invested heavily in Egypt's agricultural infrastructure. She built irrigation systems to make the farmland even more productive. She encouraged farmers to increase their yields. She implemented tax policies that incentivized food production while still maintaining stable tax revenues. She was essentially turning Egypt into a food production machine, a vast agricultural engine designed to produce the maximum possible amount of grain for export. And with each improvement to Egypt's agricultural capacity, she was increasing her leverage over Rome. She was making Egypt more valuable, more important, more essential to Rome's survival. By the time she was working with Mark Antony, Egypt was exporting grain to feed not just Rome, but the armies that Rome's generals were maintaining. Antony's armies in the east required massive supplies of grain and other food products. Feeding 100,000 soldiers was not a simple task. It required an enormous supply chain, a sophisticated logistics network, access to vast quantities of grain and bread and other food products. And where did that grain come from? Egypt. Cleopatra was literally feeding Antony's armies. She was providing the logistics that made his military operations possible. Without her grain, his soldiers would starve within weeks. Without her resources, his campaigns couldn't continue. Without her support, his Eastern Empire would collapse like a house of cards. This wasn't just about providing supplies. This was about having leverage. This was about having the ability to say, if you don't do what I want, your armies will go hungry. If you don't listen to me, your soldiers will starve. If you don't treat me as an equal, I will cut off the supply of grain and watch your entire military machine crumble. Cleopatra also minted her own currency. She had her own coins, stamped with her own image and her own name. Her face was on Egyptian money. Her name was on Egyptian coins. This was radical in ways that modern people might not appreciate. Most client states, most subordinate kingdoms, didn't have the autonomy to mint their own coins. If you were subordinate to Rome, Rome controlled your currency. Rome decided what your coins looked like. Rome controlled the money supply in your territory. But Cleopatra had fought for and maintained the right to mint her own coins. Minting your own currency was a sign of independence, a sign that you were a sovereign state, not just a province of Rome. By maintaining her own currency system, Cleopatra was constantly broadcasting a message to the world. E.g., PT is independent. Egypt makes its own decisions. Egypt answers to no one. Egypt is not subordinate to Rome. She could control inflation. She could adjust the supply of money in her economy. She could use currency policy to encourage trade or to punish rivals. She could devalue her currency to make Egyptian exports cheaper and more competitive. She could increase the value of her currency to protect Egyptian wages and purchasing power. She had economic tools that most ancient rulers didn't have. And she understood how to use them. She understood that controlling the money supply was almost as important as controlling the grain supply. Reward her supporters with grants, and reward her supporters with grants and positions and wealth. She could punish her enemies by cutting off their access to Egyptian trade and Egyptian wealth. She could do all of these things without asking Rome for permission or for funding. She didn't have to negotiate with Rome about what to do with her own wealth. She didn't have to ask Octavian's permission to fund Antony's military campaigns. She didn't have to consult with Rome about how to use her economic resources. This independence was dangerous because it meant that she couldn't be controlled the way that other rulers could be controlled. If Rome tried to cut off her funding, she didn't care because she had her own sources of wealth. If Rome tried to starve her government into submission by imposing economic sanctions, she couldn't be starved because she controlled the grain supply and could simply stop exporting grain to Rome, thereby starving Rome instead. If Rome tried to isolate Egypt economically, Egypt had trade relationships with dozens of other kingdoms and states, and could simply redirect its trade elsewhere. She was economically autonomous in a way that almost no other ruler of her era could claim. And economic autonomy translates into political autonomy. When you don't have to ask anyone for money, when you can fund your own government and your own military. When you control resources that others desperately need, you become much harder to enroll, much harder to threaten, much harder to defeat without committing massive resources to the effort. You become independent, you become sovereign, you become someone that other rulers have to negotiate with as an equal. This is what made Egypt so dangerous to Octavian. This is why he eventually had to move against her with full military force. He couldn't negotiate her into submission because she didn't need anything from Rome. He couldn't starve her government into collapse because she was the one controlling the grain supply. He couldn't impose economic sanctions on her because she was too wealthy and too well integrated into the trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean. He had to destroy her militarily, and even that was going to be difficult because she had the economic resources to fight him effectively. She could fund armies. She could build fleets. She could pay mercenaries and soldiers and commanders. She could sustain a prolonged military campaign against Rome. And all of this was possible because she controlled Egypt's vast wealth. The economic danger that Cleopatra represented wasn't obvious to everyone in Rome. Some Romans saw her as just a woman, as a queen of a foreign country who happened to be wealthy. But the people who actually understood power, the people who understood what it meant to control a major food supply, the people who understood currency and trade networks, and the foundations of economic strength, they understood that Cleopatra's wealth and economic power made her a direct threat to Rome's hegemony. And as her relationship with Antony deepened, as Egypt became more integrated into Antony's Eastern coalition, as the economic resources of Egypt flowed into Antony's military machine, the threat became even more clear and present. If Cleopatra and Antony won their conflict with Octavian, if they managed to defeat him and consolidate power over the Eastern Mediterranean, the balance of power in the ancient world would shift fundamentally. Rome would no longer have access to Egyptian grain on the terms that Rome demanded. The Western Empire would be subordinate to the Eastern Empire, and Cleopatra's economic power would be the foundation of that Eastern dominance. The entire structure of the Mediterranean world would be inverted. The center of power would shift from Rome to Alexandria. The ruler of the Eastern Mediterranean would be the dominant figure in the ancient world, and that ruler would be Cleopatra, or would be completely dependent on Cleopatra's economic support. That was unacceptable to Octavian. That was a future he could not allow to come to pass, and that is why he was willing to commit massive resources to destroying her. The economic threat that Cleopatra represented was existential to Rome's future, and Octavian understood this perfectly. But economic power alone doesn't win wars. And this is where Cleopatra's naval strength becomes crucial to understanding her danger. Cleopatra had inherited a naval tradition that went back centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always been a naval power. The Ptolemies had built Egypt's fleet in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt. They had maintained that fleet through generations of Ptolemaic rulers. Egypt had always maintained a strong fleet, a formidable naval presence in the Mediterranean. And Cleopatra had continued that tradition while also modernizing and strengthening it. She invested heavily in warship construction. She maintained a large navy trained and ready for combat. She understood naval strategy and tactics in ways that most rulers did not. She understood how to project power through control of the seas. She understood the importance of naval logistics, of being able to supply ships and sailors and supply lines across vast distances. She understood the relationship between naval power and economic power, between control of the seas and control of trade. In the ancient Mediterranean, naval power was everything. Control of the seas meant control of trade. It meant control of communication across the sea. It meant the ability to move armies and supplies across water quickly and safely. It meant the ability to blockade enemy ports and starve them into submission. It meant the ability to project military force across great distances without having to march armies overland through hostile territory. Rome's dominance in the Mediterranean was based most entirely on Rome's naval superiority. Rome had the best navy in the ancient world. Rome's admirals were the most experienced. Rome's ships were the most advanced. Rome controlled the seas, and Rome used that control to maintain its hegemony over the Mediterranean world. No one challenged Rome's control of the seas because no one had the resources or the will to do so. But Cleopatra's fleet was substantial. It was modern. It was well-trained. It was capable of standing up to Rome's navy in direct combat. It was a direct challenge to Rome's naval supremacy. When Cleopatra allied with Mark Antony, she brought her entire navy into the alliance. She didn't just promise to provide some naval support. She brought hundreds of warships. She brought experienced sailors and commanders. She brought the institutional knowledge of generations of Ptolemaic naval tradition. She provided warships and naval expertise. She provided the logistics necessary to support large-scale naval operations across the Mediterranean. She provided, essentially, a second naval power to rival Rome's fleet. And suddenly, Rome's naval dominance was not quite so certain. Suddenly, there was a challenger. Suddenly, there was someone who could contest Rome's control of the Mediterranean, who could fight Rome on the seas and have a genuine chance of winning. This was dangerous. This was the kind of thing that threatened the entire foundation of Roman power. A Rome without control of the seas is a Rome in crisis. A Rome that has to share the Mediterranean with another naval power is a Rome that has lost something. Non fundamental. Was a ruler who had the wealth to fund. Was a ruler who had the wealth to fund large military operations and the naval capacity to execute them. Here was a ruler who could project power across the Mediterranean and challenge Rome's dominance directly. Here was a ruler who could threaten Rome's most fundamental strategic interest, which was control of the sea lanes and the ability to move Roman armies and supplies across the Mediterranean without opposition. The fact that this ruler was also allied with Mark Antony one of Rome's most powerful generals, made the danger exponential. Antony provided military genius and ground forces. Cleopatra provided wealth, naval power, and the resources necessary to sustain a long military campaign. Together, Cleopatra and Antony represented the possibility of a genuine rival power center, a genuine alternative to Roman dominance, a genuine threat to everything Octavian was trying to build. They represented the possibility of a Mediterranean world where Rome was not hegemonic, where power was distributed between multiple centers, where the East could resist the West and possibly defeat it. And the fact that Cleopatra was the economic foundation of that power, the fact that she was bringing not just military resources, but also the wealth and food production of Egypt, the fact that she was funding Antony's military machine and providing the resources for prolonged warfare, made her the crucial piece of the puzzle. Without her, Antony would eventually run out of money and have to stop fighting. Without her, his armies would starve. Without her, his fleet would have no supplies. Antony, without Cleopatra, would have been a dangerous general, but not an existential threat to Rome. But Antony, with Cleopatra's resources, with access to Egypt's vast wealth, with access to Egypt's grain supply, with access to Egypt's naval capacity and Egypt's experienced sailors and Egypt's naval tradition, became something much more dangerous. He became the potential founder of a new empire. He became a rival not just to Octavian's authority in Rome, but to the entire Roman system of hegemony. He became someone who could plausibly defeat Octavian and reshape the entire Mediterranean world in his image. The propaganda war with Octavian wasn't just about words and speeches and public relations. It was about competing visions of what the ancient world should look like. It was about fundamentally different ways of organizing power and society. It was about what kind of future the Mediterranean world would have. Octavian believed that Rome should dominate the entire Mediterranean, that Rome should be the center of power, that all other kingdoms and states should be subordinate to Rome. This vision wasn't crazy or unusual for the time. This was the standard imperial vision. This was how powerful empires thought about their role in the world. A great power should be hegemonic. It should control all the territory and all the resources it possibly could. It should eliminate rivals and subordinate everyone else. This was the way the world was supposed to work. But Cleopatra and Antony represented an alternative vision. They represented the idea that the ancient world could be organized differently, that power could be distributed among multiple centers rather than being concentrated in Rome, that the East could resist Western hegemony and preserve its independence, that Egypt could remain independent and powerful, that a strong coalition of Eastern states could rival Rome's power and possibly exceed it. These were fundamentally incompatible visions. There was no way to compromise between them. There was no middle ground. One vision would prevail, and one would be destroyed. And the person who would ultimately decide which vision prevailed was not a philosopher or a theorist debating in the academy. It was going to be determined by military force. But before military force came into play, there was a battle of narratives. There was a competition over how people perceived Cleopatra, over what story they believed about her, over whether they saw her as a legitimate ruler or as a threat. And this is where Octavian's propaganda became so important. Octavian understood that controlling the narrative was almost as important as controlling military force. Octavian needed to convince the Roman people that Cleopatra was a danger, that her vision of the world was fundamentally alien and threatening, that Rome had to fight her not just for political reasons, but for survival itself. He needed to make her monstrous in the eyes of the Roman public. And he succeeded brilliantly. He worked with Roman historians and poets and playwrights. He shaped the narrative systematically. He made sure that stories about Cleopatra's seductions, about her foreign ways, about her influence over Antony, about her ambitions to conquer Rome and establish herself as the ultimate ruler of the Mediterranean, all of these stories circulated widely through Roman society. He made her the villain in a story where Rome was the hero fighting for survival against an Oriental despot. The reality was much more complicated and nuanced. The reality was that Cleopatra was a legitimate ruler of an ancient kingdom with a 300-year history, that she was defending Egypt's independence against Roman expansion, that she was working to preserve her dynasty and protect her children from being eliminated by Rome. But Octavian's propaganda didn't care about the messy complexity of reality. It cared about perception, and perception is often more powerful than reality in politics. Perception shapes how people understand the world. Perception determines whether people will support a war or oppose it. Perception determines whether a ruler is seen as legitimate or illegitimate. But the propaganda war went both ways. Cleopatra and Antony also had their own narratives and their own propaganda machines. They presented themselves as defenders of the East against Western imperialism and Roman hegemony. They presented Octavian as a tyrant, trying to impose his will on the entire Mediterranean by force. They appealed to the traditions and the pride of the Eastern kingdoms and the Eastern people. They tried to build a coalition of Eastern states united against Rome. They had their own propaganda machine, their own stories, their own vision of the world. And in many parts of the East, their narrative was actually more persuasive than Octavian's. Eastern people didn't necessarily see Rome as the hero. They saw Rome as a foreign power trying to dominate them, to impose Roman law and Roman ways on them, to reduce them to the status of subordinate provinces. They saw Cleopatra and Antony as defenders of their autonomy and their traditions and their independence. So the propaganda war wasn't entirely one-sided. It was genuinely contested. But in the end, it was the war that Octavian had the resources to win, because Octavian controlled Rome, and Rome had the military power to enforce its narrative. Rome won the military war, and therefore Rome's version of history became the official version. Octavian could decide which histories were written, which stories were preserved, which accounts would be passed down to future generations. He essentially rewrote the historical record to make himself look good, and he used that power ruthlessly and systematically. He made sure that the versions of history that survived were versions that made him look good, and made Cleopatra and Antony look bad. He made sure that future generations would see Cleopatra as a seductress and a threat, rather than as a sophisticated political operator defending her kingdom. He made sure that Antony would be remembered as a man who had fallen under the spell of an Oriental temptress, rather than as a strategic partner working to build an alternative political order. The propaganda was so effective that it shaped how people have thought about Cleopatra for 2,000 years. Even today, most people think of her as a woman who seduced powerful men, not as a woman who was a powerful political operator in her own right. Octavian's propaganda succeeded beyond even his wildest dreams. The donations of Alexandria happened in 34 BC, 2 years before the final military confrontation with Octavian. Cleopatra and Antony held a grand ceremony in Alexandria, the capital of Egypt. It was not a small, quiet event. It was a massive public spectacle designed to announce their vision to the world. They celebrated their children. They distributed kingdoms and territories to their family members. They proclaimed new divisions of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. They announced a new order. And in doing so, they essentially rewrote the political map of the ancient world. The ceremony was designed to be visible, to be talked about, to be remembered. They wanted everyone in the Mediterranean world to understand what they were doing, They wanted the message to be clear. From Octavian's perspective, what they did was absolutely catastrophic. They declared that Cleopatra's children with Antony would rule various eastern kingdoms. They declared that their eldest son, Alexander Helios, would rule Armenia and the Median territories. They declared that their younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, would rule Phoenicia and Cilicia and Syria. They declared that Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Caesar, would rule Egypt as the legitimate heir to the Ptolemaic throne. They made proclamations about which territories belonged to whom, and they did all of this without asking Rome's permission. They did all of this as if Rome's authority in these territories was irrelevant, as if Egypt and the Eastern kingdoms had the right to organize themselves however they pleased without reference to Rome. This was more than just a political statement. This was a direct challenge to Rome's authority. This was a declaration that the Eastern Mediterranean was not Rome's to control, that Egypt and its allies had the right to organize themselves as they saw fit, that Rome's dominance was not universal and not inevitable. From Rome's perspective, this was intolerable. This violated everything that Rome believed about its place in the world. But from Cleopatra and Antony's perspective, it was essential. They were trying to create a new political order, a coalition of Eastern states under Egyptian and Roman leadership, a sphere of influence that would rival Rome's dominance in the West. The donations of Alexandria were their way of announcing that order to the world. They were saying, this is what the New World Order looks like. This is how power will be distributed in the future. This is what we are fighting for. And by making these declarations in such a public, formal way, surrounded by thousands of people, with official proclamations and religious ceremonies, they were essentially committing themselves to the struggle. They were saying that they were willing to fight Octavian to the death to defend this vision of the world. They were saying that there was no compromise, no middle ground, no half measures. It was all or nothing. They had thrown down a gauntlet that could not be picked up and set aside. Octavian understood immediately that this was a point of no return. He understood that Cleopatra and Antony were no longer going to be satisfied with anything less than a fundamental reorganization of Mediterranean power. He understood that they would have to be destroyed. And he began to prepare for that destruction with the full resources of Rome behind him. He began to organize his military forces. He began to recruit soldiers. He began to secure the loyalty of his supporters. He began to prepare for war. The donations of Alexandria were the moment when the conflict became inevitable, when it moved from being a political disagreement to being a military necessity. Before that moment, there might have been opportunities for negotiation, opportunities for compromise, opportunities for some kind of settlement that both sides could live with. But after the donations, there was no turning back. Cleopatra and Antony had committed themselves to a vision of the world that was fundamentally incompatible with Octavian's vision, and one of them was going to have to be destroyed. The threat of Cleopatra extended far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the realm of political negotiation. It extended into the darkest corners of ancient politics, into the world of espionage, poison, and assassination. Cleopatra had an extensive network of spies spread throughout the Mediterranean. She had agents in Rome. She had agents in the major cities of the East. She had people who reported to her on the movements of her rivals, the intentions of her enemies, the vulnerabilities of her opponents. This intelligence network gave her advantages that even Antony didn't have. She knew what her enemies were planning before they executed those plans. She could respond to threats before they fully materialized. She could identify vulnerabilities and exploit them. Intelligence is one of the most valuable resources in ancient politics, and Cleopatra had better intelligence than almost anyone else. But intelligence gathering is not enough. Sometimes you need to act on that intelligence. Sometimes you need to eliminate threats directly. And this is where the historical record becomes murky, where the sources suggest that Cleopatra was willing to go further than most rulers would go. There are suggestions in the historical sources that Cleopatra used poison to eliminate rivals. Her own brother Ptolemy XIV disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and historians have long suspected that Cleopatra had him poisoned. Her sister Arsinoe IV was executed, possibly on Cleopatra's orders, after Antony defeated her in battle. These deaths were politically convenient for Cleopatra. Hay removed rivals who could have challenged her authority. The fact that she was willing to use poison, the fact that she had knowledge of chemistry and toxins, the fact that she understood how to eliminate threats without leaving obvious evidence, all of this made her extraordinarily dangerous. In ancient politics, the ability to have someone killed quietly, without witnesses, without leaving obvious traces, was one of the most powerful abilities you could have. It meant that your enemies couldn't be sure of their safety. It meant that rivals could disappear at any moment. It meant that the threat of assassination hung over everyone who opposed you. Cleopatra understood the power of this threat. She understood that it was not just the actual assassinations that mattered, but the fear that assassinations could happen at any time. The rumors about her involvement in the deaths of her relatives were well known. Everyone knew that Cleopatra had potentially eliminated rivals through poison, and this knowledge made her more dangerous, made her harder to oppose, made her a more formidable political operator. In the ancient world, a ruler who was willing and able to have people assassinated was a ruler to be feared. A ruler who had demonstrated knowledge of chemistry and toxins was even more to be feared, and Cleopatra had both of these characteristics. She had shown that she was willing to use extreme measures to consolidate power. She had shown that she had the knowledge and the resources to eliminate threats. And she had shown that she was willing to cover up these actions, to live with the rumors, to use the fear that the rumors generated as a tool of political control. This ruthlessness, this willingness to go to extremes, this comfort with poison and assassination, all of this made her a genuinely dangerous political operator in a way that transcended normal political competition. The final source of Cleopatra's danger was her use of religion and culture as tools of political control. In Egypt, she was not just a political ruler, she was a divine being. She was the embodiment of the goddess Isis on earth. She was the representative of the gods themselves. This was not just religious rhetoric. This was actual theology. Egyptians believed that Cleopatra was a god. They believed that she was sacred. They believed that opposing her was not just political rebellion, but also religious sacrilege. This gave her authority that was almost impossible to challenge. How do you rebel against a god? How do you oppose a ruler who is believed to be divine? You can challenge a political ruler. You can argue with a political ruler. You can negotiate with a political ruler. But challenging a god is a different matter entirely. It's not just rebellion. It's heresy. It's going against the fundamental beliefs of your entire civilization. By positioning herself as a divine being, Cleopatra was essentially making herself unchallengeable. She was creating a form of authority that transcended normal political power. She was rooting herself in the deepest beliefs of Egyptian civilization, and this made her extraordinarily difficult to remove from power. Even if people disagreed with her policies, even if they wanted her removed for political reasons, they would hesitate to act because she was a god, and gods cannot be opposed. This was dangerous because it created a ruler who was essentially immune to the normal mechanisms of political change. A normal ruler can be deposed if enough people support the deposition, but a ruler who is a god cannot be deposed. She can only be destroyed by foreign military force, by a power that does not recognize her divinity, by an invader who is willing to commit sacrilege to remove her. And when that finally happened, when Octavian eventually destroyed her and took control of Egypt, it was a profound violation of Egyptian religious beliefs. It was a demonstration that even gods can be killed. It was a cataclysm in the Egyptian worldview. But Cleopatra had succeeded in using religion to make herself as difficult to challenge as any ruler in the ancient world. She had created a form of authority based on divinity that transcended normal political power. And this made her extraordinarily dangerous, made her extraordinarily difficult to remove, and made her one of the most formidable political operators in the ancient Mediterranean. But of course, religion and cultural authority were only going to hold off Rome for so long. Octavian was not a man who believed in gods that he didn't control. He believed in military force. He believed in conquest. He believed that Rome's destiny was to dominate the entire Mediterranean, and anyone who stood in the way of that destiny would be destroyed. And so, in the autumn of 32 BC, the moment of reckoning finally arrived. Cleopatra and Antony had spent years building their Eastern coalition, strengthening their military forces, consolidating their power. They had the wealth of Egypt behind them. They had the military genius of Antony. They had the naval forces and the strategic vision of Cleopatra. They believed they could win. They believed they could defeat Octavian. They believed they could reshape the ancient world according to their vision. But they were wrong. What followed was one of the most decisive military confrontations in ancient history, a battle that would determine the fate of empires and the future of the Mediterranean world. The Battle of Actium took place in 31 BC in the waters off the coast of northwestern Greece, near the town of Actium. This was the moment where all of Cleopatra's power, all of her strategy, all of her carefully laid plans would be tested against Octavian's determination and Rome's overwhelming military might. The battle itself was primarily a naval engagement, though both sides had substantial land forces as well. Antony commanded approximately 500 ships and around 70,000 infantry. Octavian had brought about 400 ships and roughly 80,000 infantry. On the surface, the numbers favoured Antony slightly. But Octavian had something that numbers alone couldn't measure. He had the most brilliant military strategist in Rome at his side. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa was perhaps the greatest naval commander of the ancient world. Agrippa had already cut off Antony and Cleopatra's supply lines, had already positioned his forces to blockade their retreat to Egypt, had already begun to starve them of the resources they needed to sustain their military forces. Antony's soldiers were diseased. His fleet was being eaten away by attrition and sickness. His supplies were running critically low. Every day that passed without a decisive battle worked in Octavian's favour, chipping away at their coalition, reducing their capacity to fight. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had been eager to fight for Antony and Cleopatra were growing increasingly demoralised. They could see that defeat was likely. They could see that Octavian's forces were better positioned, better supplied, better organized. They could see that hope was fading with each passing day, and as hope faded, loyalty began to crack. Desertion became more common. Soldiers slipped away in the night to go over to Octavian's side. Entire units began to question their orders. The coalition that Cleopatra and Antony had so carefully built was beginning to crumble from within, even before the first shot was fired in actual combat. Cleopatra understood this perfectly. She understood that they couldn't afford to wait. She understood that a prolonged stalemate would lead to their eventual defeat. She understood that they had to break through Octavian's blockade, had to fight their way out, had to restore their supply lines and their connection to Egypt. And so, she argued for a naval battle, for a direct engagement with Octavian's fleet. She knew the risks. She knew that Octavian's forces were well positioned and that a naval battle in these waters would be extraordinarily dangerous. But she also knew that doing nothing meant eventual starvation and surrender, so she pushed for battle. And Antony, despite the advice of some of his commanders who urged a tactical retreat inland, agreed with her assessment. They would HT. They would try to break through Octavian's lines and escape back to Egypt, where they could regroup and continue the war on more favourable terms. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical naval warfare, though not in the way that Cleopatra and Antony had hoped. Cleopatra had positioned her fleet with meticulous care. She understood naval tactics better than most military commanders of her era. Her largest ships, her most powerful warships, equipped with the latest siege technology and the heaviest weaponry, were positioned at the front. Her treasure fleet, carrying the vast wealth of Egypt, the money that had funded this entire military campaign, was positioned at the rear under careful guard, protected by a secondary line of warships. She had stationed her fastest ships where they could potentially break through enemy lines if a breakthrough became necessary. She had positioned her flagship, the Antonia, in a location where he could observe the entire battle and make adjustments to strategy as the situation evolved. She had studied the waters, understood the currents, understood the weather patterns. She had positioned her fleet in a location where the terrain would work to their advantage. Everything was planned. Everything was thought through. But even the best-laid plans can encounter circumstances beyond their control, and the Battle of Actium was going to be one of those moments. The battle began in the morning, with both fleets advancing toward each other under full sail. For hours, the fighting raged with an intensity that was almost beyond comprehension. Ships rammed into each other in violent collisions that left both vessels damaged and sinking. Arrows flew through the air in clouds so thick they blocked out the sun. Men screamed as they died, as they were burned by fire, as they drowned in the sea. The waters of the Ionian Sea ran red with blood. The air filled with smoke from burning ships and the acrid smell of death and destruction. But gradually, it became clear that something was going wrong. Octavian's forces, despite being slightly outnumbered in raw ship count, were demonstrating superior tactics, superior discipline, superior coordination. They were not breaking. They were not retreating. They were holding their ground and slowly, methodically, beginning to gain the advantage. And then, with a skill born of years of experience, with a tactical brilliance that few commanders could match, Agrippa began to execute a brilliant maneuver. He began to execute a coordinated series of movements designed to encircle Antony's fleet. He was attempting to trap them, to box them in, to prevent their escape and force them to fight on terms that favoured Octavian's forces. Cleopatra, watching from her flagship, understood immediately what was happening. She understood that if Antony's fleet was trapped, if they were forced to fight a battle of attrition against Octavian's forces, they would eventually lose. Octavian had the advantage in supplies, in fresh forces, in military organisation. A prolonged battle in these waters would end only one way, with the destruction of Antony's fleet and the capture or death of Antony and Cleopatra. And so she made a decision that would later be criticised as cowardice, but was actually an act of strategic genius. She ordered her fleet to hoist sails. She gathered the ships that could move quickly. She took her treasure fleet, her war chests, her most valuable assets, and she broke through a gap in Octavian's lines. The escape was dramatic, executed with perfect timing and precise manoeuvring. Her ships burst through the enemy formation, sailing south at full speed toward Egypt. Antony, seeing his ally escaping and understanding that the battle was lost, abandoned the rest of his fleet and followed Cleopatra to Egypt. The forces left behind fought on valiantly, but without their commanders, without hope of victory, they eventually surrendered. Octavian had won the battle, More importantly, Octavian had won the war, or so it seemed. Cleopatra and Antony had escaped with their lives, with significant portions of their fleet, and most importantly, with the treasure of Egypt still intact. But the psychological impact of their defeat was enormous. The legend of their invincibility had been shattered. The confidence of their coalition began to crumble. Kings and rulers who had supported Antony and Cleopatra began to reconsider their allegiances. The dream of an Eastern Mediterranean empire that could rival Rome's power was beginning to die, but Cleopatra was not yet finished. She had one more fight in her. Octavian's forces pursued Cleopatra and Antony back to Egypt, and the final confrontation came at Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, the magnificent city where Cleopatra had ruled for nearly 2 decades. Alexandria was one of the great cities of the ancient world, a center of commerce and culture and learning. Its walls were strong. Its population was large. It should have been defensible. It should have been possible to hold against siege. But Octavian was not interested in a prolonged siege. He wanted victory quickly. He wanted to crush Cleopatra and Antony before there was any possibility of them escaping or regrouping or receiving support from their allies. And so he advanced with overwhelming force, bringing his legions south from the north with almost military precision, cutting off Eve, a possible avenue of escape for Cleopatra and Antony. The siege of Alexandria was less a traditional military siege and more a rapid advance by overwhelming military force, combined with the psychological warfare of an army that could not be stopped. Octavian's legions marched south from the north with incredible speed. They brought siege engines. They brought artillery. They brought overwhelming numbers. Each day brought them closer to Alexandria. Each day brought them closer to their final victory. Antony tried desperately to mount a defense. He tried to hold the city. He tried to gather what forces he had left to push back against Octavian's advance. He organized the defense of Alexandria. He positioned soldiers at the walls. He prepared for a siege that might last weeks or months. But the cause was already lost. The psychological defeat at Actium had devastated the morale of his remaining forces. Soldiers who had been loyal to Antony for years, soldiers who had fought alongside him in Parthia and Armenia, soldiers who had believed in his cause, began to desert. They could see that defeat was inevitable, written in the relentless march of Octavian's legions. They could see that the cause they had been fighting for was collapsing, that their sacrifices had been for nothing, that Rome's power was simply too great. And so they abandoned their posts and went over to Octavian's side, or they simply slipped away into the Egyptian countryside, trying to escape the collapse of everything they had known. Antony, desperate and trapped, attempted one final military engagement. He tried to rally his remaining forces for one last battle outside the walls of Alexandria. He tried to inspire them with speeches about honor and glory and the importance of their cause. He tried to convince them that they could still win, that they could still push back Octavian's advance, that Alexandria could still be held. But it was hopeless. The soldiers simply refused to fight. They knew the odds. They knew that they had already lost. His generals began to negotiate with Octavian, trying to secure terms for surrender, trying to save their own lives in the face of certain defeat. The end was coming, and everyone knew it. The magnificent city of Alexandria, which had been the capital of Cleopatra's kingdom, which had been the jewel of the Mediterranean world, was about to fall to Roman arms. Everything that Cleopatra had built, everything that she had fought for, everything that she had sacrificed to protect, was about to be taken from her. Antony, understanding that all was lost, attempted to take his own life. According to historical accounts, he stabbed himself with his sword. Cleopatra, when she heard that Antony was dying, rushed to be at his side. She held him as he died. She cradled the man who had been her partner, her ally, and her last hope for preserving Egypt's independence. And with his death, something inside her broke. She understood that the game was over. She understood that Octavian would never allow her to continue to rule Egypt. She understood that he would either kill her or force her into humiliation and captivity. And so she made a final decision, one that would echo through history and cement her legacy as one of the most remarkable women who ever lived. The question of how Cleopatra died has been debated by historians for 2,000 years. According to the popular legend, Cleopatra allowed an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, to bite her. The image of the beautiful queen calmly allowing a snake to kill her has captured imaginations for generations. It's the romantic version of her death, the version that makes her seem noble and heroic, choosing death on her own terms rather than submission to Octavian. But the historical reality is more complex and more interesting than the legend. Ancient sources, including the historian Plutarch, suggest that Cleopatra may not have died from a snake bite at all. Some sources indicate that she used poison instead, possibly a toxin of her own creation, something she had learned about through her studies in chemistry. Other sources suggest that she may have used a sharp implement, perhaps a hairpin, to inject poison into her own veins. The exact method remains uncertain, but the result was the same. Cleopatra died rather than face capture and humiliation by Octavian. Modern historians have debated whether this was truly suicide, or whether Octavian ordered her assassination and then covered it up to make it appear to be suicide. Some scholars argue that Cleopatra would have been too valuable alive as a prisoner, that Octavian would have wanted to parade her through Rome as a trophy, to humiliate her in front of the Roman people. Other scholars counter that Octavian feared that Cleopatra alive could become a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for those who opposed his rule, a martyr around which a rebellion could form. The truth may be that Octavian allowed Cleopatra to die rather than stop her, that he recognized that her death served his purposes better than her capture. Or the truth may be that he ordered her death himself and then allowed the suicide narrative to persist because it served his purposes. We may never know for certain. What we know is that Cleopatra, the woman who had wielded such tremendous power, who had commanded armies and navies, who had shaped the destiny of empires, was dead. She died in 30 BC at the age of 39. She died in Egypt, the land she had ruled. She died by her own hand, or at the very least, she died rather than submit to Octavian's will. And in dying, she ensured that her death would become part of her legend, that she would be remembered not as a defeated ruler, but as a woman of such strength and dignity that she chose death over degradation. Octavian, standing in Alexandria after Cleopatra's death, had achieved his goal. He had destroyed his rival. He had eliminated the threat that Cleopatra represented, but he had also eliminated the last remnants of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the 300-year-old kingdom that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies. With her death, an entire dynasty ended. An entire world ended. The Mediterranean would never be the same again. Egypt would become a province of Rome, administered by Roman governors, its wealth flowing into Roman treasuries. The independence that Cleopatra had fought so hard to preserve would be gone forever. But Cleopatra's children were still alive, and they represented a continuing threat to Octavian's rule, or at least, Octavian saw them that way. Cleopatra had given birth to 4 children, and each one represented a part of her vision for the future of the Mediterranean world. The oldest was Caesarion. Her son with Julius Caesar born before her relationship with Antony had even begun. Caesarion had been declared the legitimate heir to Egypt and had been given the symbolic name Ptolemy Caesarion, which literally meant King of Kings. He was the living embodiment of a union between the great Julius Caesar and the great Cleopatra, a child who carried within him the blood of two of the greatest powers of the ancient world. The other three children were her offspring, with Mark Antony, and they had been groomed from birth to be the rulers of the territories that Cleopatra and Antony were fighting to control. There was Alexander Helios, named after Alexander the Great, who had been declared the ruler of Armenia and the Median territories, vast regions in the heart of Asia. There was Ptolemy Philadelphus, who had been declared the ruler of Phoenicia and Cilicia and Syria, the wealthy Mediterranean coastlands. And there was Cleopatra Selene, the only daughter who had been betrothed to various Eastern rulers as part of her mother's diplomatic strategy, a way of building alliances and securing relationships with neighboring powers. These children, in Cleopatra's mind, represented the future. They represented the possibility of a continuing dynasty, the possibility that the blood of Cleopatra and her ambitions and her intelligence could pass to a new generation. They represented the possibility that even if Cleopatra herself was defeated, her vision could live on through her children, that they would grow up to rule the Eastern Mediterranean, that they would preserve the independence and the power of Egypt and the Eastern kingdoms. But Octavian could not allow this. He could not tolerate the possibility of a new generation of rulers who had Cleopatra's blood in their veins, who had inherited her intelligence and her understanding of power. Most critically, he could not allow Caesarion to live because Caesarion represented a direct and undeniable claim to both Egypt and Rome, a potential heir to both kingdoms, a child who might one day challenge Octavian's authority with the full weight of legitimate inheritance behind him. Caesarion had to die, and so Octavian ordered Caesarion to be executed. The young man, barely in his adulthood, who had never had the chance to rule, who had never had the opportunity to demonstrate his own abilities, who had never had the chance to fulfill his mother's ambitions for him and for Egypt, was killed on Octavian's orders. The death of Caesarion was not merely a political act, not merely the elimination of a rival. It was an act of symbolic violence, a statement that Octavian would tolerate no rivals, no potential threats, no one who could challenge his authority and his vision of the future. It was a message to anyone who might have thought of continuing the resistance. Resistance was futile. Opposition was fatal. Octavian was the supreme power now, and anyone who stood in his way would be destroyed. But Octavian was more careful with the other children. He did not execute them, at least not immediately. Instead, he captured them, brought them to Rome in captivity, and displayed them in his great triumphal parade through the streets of the city. He paraded Cleopatra Selene and her brothers through Rome in chains, showing the Roman people the conquered children of their enemies, demonstrating that the threat had been eliminated, that the resistance had been crushed, that a new order had been established. This was brilliant psychological warfare. By displaying the children but not executing them, Octavian demonstrated both his power and his clemency. He showed that he was merciful, that he would not execute innocent children, even when those children represented a potential threat to his authority. But he also showed that the children were now his, that they were captives under his control, that their fate was in his hands, and that he could decide their future as he saw fit. Cleopatra Selene, the youngest of Cleopatra's children and the only daughter, eventually married a North African king named Juba II and bore children of her own. Some historians believe that she may have been the source of stories about her mother that preserved some semblance of truth amid all the propaganda and the distortions and the lies that Octavian had carefully constructed. She carried forward her mother's memory. She carried forward stories of her mother's power and her mother's intelligence. She gave her own children knowledge of their grandmother, knowledge of the woman who had ruled Egypt. The children of Cleopatra carried forward a biological memory of their mother, a direct genetic link to the woman who had ruled Egypt and who had challenged Rome itself. But they did not carry forward her power. They did not carry forward her independence. They had been stripped of their inheritance, their kingdoms, their status. They had been reduced to captives and bargaining chips in Octavian's political games, tools that he could use to consolidate his power and demonstrate his dominance. Cleopatra had fought for them, had tried desperately to ensure their future, had positioned them carefully to rule in an Eastern Mediterranean world that no longer existed. And she had failed. The world she had envisioned, the Eastern Empire that could rival Rome, would never come to be. Her children would never rule the territories she had envisioned for them. And that failure was perhaps the most tragic aspect of her life. Why, ultimately, was Cleopatra truly dangerous? The answer goes far beyond the simple narratives that have survived in history, far beyond the stories about seduction and romance that have so dominated the way we think about her. The reality is that Cleopatra was dangerous for reasons that were far more fundamental, far more threatening to the established order, far more likely to inspire fear in the hearts of those who opposed her. She was dangerous because she represented an alternative to Rome's seemingly inevitable dominance of the Mediterranean world. She represented the possibility that the ancient world could be organized differently, that power could be distributed among multiple centers rather than being concentrated in Rome, that an Eastern Empire under Egyptian leadership could rival Rome's might and possibly exceed it. She was dangerous because she controlled resources that Rome desperately needed. She controlled the grain supply that fed Rome's population. She controlled trade routes that enriched Rome's merchants. She controlled the wealth of Egypt, one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. Without her cooperation, Rome's system would begin to strain. Without her resources, the great cities would begin to starve. Between economic power and political power. She understood how to leverage one form of power to increase another form of power. She understood that controlling resources meant controlling options, meant controlling the futures of other people, meant having the ability to impose your will on others. She was dangerous because she understood power in all of its forms. Military and economic and cultural and religious and psychological. She could project military force through her fleets and her armies. She could project economic force through her control of trade and grain. She could project cultural force, RCE, through her patronage of the arts and her dominance of intellectual life. She could project religious force through her positioning as a god on earth. She could project psychological force through her intelligence, her charisma, her mastery of rhetoric and persuasion. She was a complete operator, understanding and capable of wielding every tool of power that existed in her world. She was dangerous because she was willing to do whatever was necessary to preserve her kingdom and protect her children. She would poison her own family members if they threatened her authority. She would assassinate rivals. She would wage war. She would sacrifice her own position if necessary to protect Egypt's independence. She had no qualms about using extreme measures. She had no hesitation about making difficult choices. She was ruthless in pursuit of her goals. And this ruthlessness, combined with her competence and her understanding of power, made her extraordinarily formidable. She was dangerous because she was competent. And this cannot be emphasized enough. In an ancient world filled with incompetent rulers, with men who inherited their power and had no idea how to use it, with rulers who relied on advisors and bureaucrats to actually run their kingdoms, Cleopatra was genuinely, extraordinarily competent. She understood how governments work, how to organize bureaucracies, how to distribute power effectively among her subordinates while maintaining her own control. She understood how to motivate people, how to inspire loyalty, how to convince people to follow her. She understood how to build alliances with other rulers, how to negotiate effectively, how to create mutually beneficial arrangements. She understood strategy in all of its complexity. She understood economics in ways that most ancient rulers did not. She understood how to project power in multiple directions simultaneously. She understood how to build a coalition of diverse powers and maintain unity among them. She understood how to fight, how to conduct military campaigns, how to think like a military strategist. She was everything that a ruler needed to be in order to survive in the brutal, dangerous world of ancient politics, and she was extraordinarily good at all of it. But ultimately, she was not powerful enough. No single ruler, no single kingdom could stand against the combined might of Rome at the height of Roman power. Rome had the resources, the military organization, the political stability, and the will to dominate. Rome had leaders who were willing to commit whatever forces were necessary to achieve victory. Rome had a system that could absorb defeated kingdoms and incorporate them into its own structure. Rome, in the end, was simply too strong. Cleopatra was one of the most remarkable women who ever lived, but she was born into a world where she was ultimately fighting against the tide of history. Her legacy, however, extends far beyond her military defeat or the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She demonstrated that a woman could be a statesman, a strategist, a military commander of the highest order. She demonstrated that a woman could match wits with the most powerful men of her time, could outmaneuver them, could outthink them, could compete with them on every level. She demonstrated that a woman could rule effectively, could inspire loyalty in her subordinates and her soldiers, could project power across vast distances, could shape the destiny of nations through her decisions and her will. She demonstrated that a woman could be taken seriously as a political operator, rather than being reduced to a mere romantic figure, a pretty ornament in the court of powerful men. She demonstrated that a woman could have genuine authority, that a woman could command respect, that a woman's word could matter in the councils of power. Of course, history has not been kind in preserving that demonstration. The Roman propaganda that Octavian created, propaganda that was deliberately designed to undermine Cleopatra's authority and discredit her as a political operator, succeeded so thoroughly that most people throughout the subsequent centuries have thought of Cleopatra as a seductress rather than as a political operator. Most people have thought of her as a woman who used her beauty to manipulate men, rather than as a woman who used her intelligence, her wit, her understanding of power and strategy to accomplish her objectives. The myth of Cleopatra, the lover, has overshadowed the reality of Cleopatra, the ruler. The story of her romantic entanglements has been told and retold while her political accomplishments have been forgotten or minimized. The image of a woman who seduced powerful men has been substituted for the reality of a woman who was genuinely powerful in her own right. But for those who look deeper, for those who examine the historical record with care and skepticism, for those who are willing to question the narratives that have been handed down to us, it becomes clear that Cleopatra was far more dangerous, far more competent, far more remarkable than the popular narrative suggests. She was a woman who understood power in all of its complexity. She was a woman who wielded it effectively across a range of different domains. And she was a woman who nearly changed the course of history. She nearly defeated Rome. She nearly established an Eastern empire that could rival Rome's power. She nearly preserved Egyptian independence. She nearly ensured that her children would rule great kingdoms and that her dynasty would continue. She came close enough to scare Octavian, close enough that he felt compelled to move against her with all the force that Rome could muster. And she did all of this in a world that was fundamentally stacked against her. A world that wanted her to be nothing more than a beautiful woman whose role was to stand beside powerful men. A world that could not tolerate the idea of a female ruler with genuine power and genuine competence. A world, in other words, very much like the world we live in today, even though 2,000 years have passed. She fought that world, and she lost. But in losing, she demonstrated something that history has never forgotten, even if it has tried to hide it behind layers of propaganda and myth, even if it has tried to reduce her to a seductress and a lover. She demonstrated that a woman could be a threat to empires, that a woman could be a strategist equal to the greatest generals of her age, that a woman could be genuinely, extraordinarily dangerous to the established order. And for that reason, she deserves to be remembered not as the beautiful queen who seduced powerful men, but as what she truly was. A woman who understood power, a woman who wielded it brilliantly, a woman who challenged Rome itself and nearly won, a woman who nearly changed the course of history, a woman who was far more dangerous us than anyone wanted to admit. A woman worthy of being remembered, studied and learned from by anyone who cares about power, strategy, and the remarkable capacities that human beings can demonstrate when they are truly determined to survive and to preserve what they love.